Harlan Cobb found the first one on January 14, 1972. His best breeding bull, one 800 pounds of registered Hereford that he'd paid more for than his first truck, was dead in the east pasture. Not sick dead, not old dead. Killed. Throat open from jaw to shoulder, hide peeled back in strips, rib cage exposed where something had fed through the night. Harlan had been ranching in Kimball County for 37 years. He'd lost cattle to every cause the hill country could offer: drought, disease, lightning, rattlesnakes, the occasional desperate coyote pack. He knew what predator kills looked like. This didn't look like anything he'd ever seen. The kill was too clean, too efficient. Whatever had taken down an animal that size had done it quickly, quietly, within 400 yards of a house where 5 people slept. The dogs hadn't barked. The horses in the near corral hadn't spooked. Nothing had made a sound. Harlan stood over the carcass as the January sun crept above the cedar breaks, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The ground told a story he didn't want to read. A single set of tracks, large and feline, circling the body in patterns that suggested something had returned multiple times during the night. Not feeding frantically like a hungry predator, feeding slowly, deliberately, taking its time. He called the county extension agent, then the game warden, then 2 neighbors who'd been losing livestock for weeks and hadn't been able to explain why. By noon, 7 men stood in Harlan's pasture, looking at tracks that none of them could quite believe. "That's a cat," said Bud Wyckoff, who'd hunted lions in the Davis Mountains before the war. "Big one, maybe the biggest I've ever seen prints from." "How big?" Bud didn't answer immediately. He was measuring the track against his hand, against his boot, against everything he knew about the species that was supposed to be nearly extinct in the Texas hill country. "Big enough that I don't think one man could kill it," he finally said. "Maybe big enough that a lot of men couldn't." That was the day the fear started. It wouldn't end for 3 years. The Texas hill country had always belonged to predators. Before European settlement, the limestone ridges and cedar-choked valleys had supported populations of mountain lions that numbered in the thousands. The cats had hunted white-tailed deer, javelina, wild turkey, everything that moved through the brushy terrain. They'd been the undisputed apex predators of central Texas, challenged only by the occasional black bear and the human hunters who'd learned to respect what they couldn't always see. Then the ranchers came. Cattle replaced deer as the dominant large herbivore. Sheep and goats filled the valleys where javelina had rooted. The lions, finding easier prey and increasing conflict with humans, became targets of systematic extermination. By 1900, bounties had reduced the hill country lion population to scattered individuals. By 1950, they were considered functionally extinct east of the Pecos. Wildlife biologists estimated that perhaps 200 or 300 mountain lions survived in the entire state, concentrated in the Trans-Pecos region and the Rio Grande borderlands. The hill country was safe. The predators were gone. That was what everyone believed. That was what Harlan Cobb had believed his entire life. Standing over his dead bull that January morning, he understood that everyone had been wrong. The kills had actually started in October 1971. But nobody connected them. Nobody wanted to connect them. Ricardo Chavez, who ran sheep on a spread near Harper, lost 11 ewes in a 3-week period. He blamed coyotes. Had to be coyotes. What else hunted sheep in the hill country? He reinforced his fences, bought new dogs, kept a rifle by his bed. The kills continued. 23 ewes by Christmas. Always at night, always silent, always with that same precise throat wound that dropped the animal before it could bleat. Chavez stopped talking about it, stopped reporting it. The losses were embarrassing. A good rancher didn't lose that many animals to predators. People would think he was careless, inattentive, unable to protect his own stock. 20 miles south, the Patterson family was having similar problems. Goats, in their case. A dozen nannies taken from a pen that was supposed to be predator-proof. No sign of digging, no broken wire, no indication of how anything had gotten in. Except the tracks. Emmett Patterson found them in the mud near the water trough, cat prints, impossibly large, pressed so deep into the ground that he could see the individual pad segments. He showed them to his wife. She told him not to mention them to anyone. "People will think we're crazy," she said. "Lions don't live here anymore." So Emmett didn't mention them. He just started locking the goats in the barn at night, started carrying his grandfather's lever action everywhere he went, started jumping at shadows in ways he hadn't since coming age. Home from Korea. The stories accumulated through the winter, passed in fragments between neighbors who trusted each other enough to admit they were scared. A calf taken from a pen in Kaya County. A full-grown horse found with its throat torn out near Fredericksburg. Dogs disappearing from yards, from porches, from chains that should have held them safe. Always at night, always without warning, always that same efficient killing that suggested something operating on instinct refined far beyond normal predation. By the time Harlan Cobb found his bull in January 1972, the hill country had lost over 60 animals. Nobody had connected the kills. Nobody had wanted to admit what the tracks meant. Nobody had understood that something had come back, or that it was just getting started. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department sent a biologist to Kimball County in late January. His name was Dr. Adrian Sterling, a 34-year-old predator specialist who'd studied mountain lions throughout the American West. He'd come expecting to debunk the reports, to find coyote kills misattributed to larger predators, to calm nervous ranchers who'd been reading too many adventure magazines. What he found instead was evidence that kept him awake for the next 3 years. The tracks were definitive, he wrote in his initial field report, dated January 28, 1972. Puma concolor tracks measuring 4.5 inches in width, consistent with an adult male at the extreme upper range of documented size. Stride length suggests a body weight exceeding 200 pounds, possibly approaching 250. For context, the average adult male mountain lion weighs between 120 and 180 pounds. An animal approaching 250 pounds would be exceptional, one of the largest cats ever documented in North America. But the tracks were only part of what troubled Sterling. The kill patterns are unlike any I've observed in 15 years of predator research, he continued. Mountain lions are typically opportunistic hunters that take what they can get. The kills in Kimball County show evidence of selection. The largest, healthiest animals are being targeted, while weaker individuals are ignored. This suggests either extreme confidence or previous experience with domestic livestock that has taught the animal optimal target selection. More concerning, the kills are concentrated in a relatively small geographic area, approximately 200 square miles, but show no evidence of a permanent territory. The animal appears to be moving continuously, killing in one area, then relocating to another, then returning to the original location days or weeks later. This is not typical lion behavior. It suggests an animal that is actively evading human response. Sterling recommended an immediate hunting response, professional trappers, trained dogs, coordinated drives through the likely habitat zones. The department approved his recommendation in early February. The hunt began on February 15, 1972. 12 men, 6 dogs, 2 weeks in the cedar breaks. They found nothing. Not nothing in the sense of failing to capture the lion. Nothing in the sense of finding no fresh sign whatsoever. The tracks that had been appearing nightly for months simply vanished. The kills stopped. The dogs, trained to follow lions sent through the roughest terrain, circled aimlessly and returned to their handlers with confused expressions. It was as if the lion had known they were coming. As if it had decided to wait them out. Sarah Whitfield was 73 years old and had lived alone on her 300-acre spread since her husband died in 1965. She didn't scare easily. She'd survived the drought of '56, the flood of 57, a rattlesnake bite in 61 that should have killed her, and the quiet devastation of watching the man she'd loved for 40 years waste away from cancer. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. There was always too much work to do. On the night of March 8, 1972, fear found her anyway. She'd gone to bed early, around 9, tired from a day of fence work that had aggravated the arthritis in her hands. The farmhouse was solid, built in 1923 by her father-in-law, maintained through decades of careful attention, but it creaked and settled in ways that usually didn't bother her. At 2:17 a.m., something scraped against the back door. Sarah woke instantly, the sound cutting through whatever dream she'd been having. She lay still, listening, telling herself it was a branch, a raccoon, the wind pushing something against the frame. The scraping came again, lower this time, deliberate. Not a branch, not a raccoon. Something testing the door, something checking if it would open. Sarah reached for the shotgun she kept beside the bed, the same 12-gauge her husband had taught her to shoot 50 years ago. Her hands were steady as she loaded 2 shells, as she swung her feet to the cold floor, as she moved through the dark house toward the kitchen. The scraping stopped. Sarah stood in the kitchen, shotgun raised, watching the back do. Or through moonlight that filtered through thin curtains. The door was solid wood, heavy, locked with a deadbolt that had never failed in 20 years. Nothing moved outside. The scraping didn't resume. But she could feel something out there. Could feel it waiting, patient, pressed against the door with a weight she could almost sense through the wood. She didn't call out, didn't challenge whatever was on the other side. Just stood there, shotgun raised, watching, until the eastern sky began to gray and the feeling of presence finally lifted. When she opened the door at sunrise, she found tracks on the porch. Cat tracks, larger than her hand, pressed into the weathered wood with a weight that had left visible indentations. And on the door itself, at about the height of her chest, 4 parallel scratches, gouged deep enough to expose bare wood beneath the paint. Sarah Whitfield had never owned a cat. She drove to her nephew's house that morning and stayed there for a week. When she returned to the farm, she brought 3 dogs and a loaded rifle she kept within arm's reach at all times. The lion didn't come back to her door, but she never slept through the night again. Dr. Sterling returned to the hill country in April 1972 after the failed hunting expedition and the reports that continued accumulating despite official insistence that the problem had been resolved. He brought maps, charts, data points that represented 87 confirmed kills across 6 counties over 7 months. When he plotted them on paper, a pattern emerged that made no sense. Standard mountain lion behavior involves territory, he explained to a gathering of ranchers at the Kimball County Courthouse. A male will establish a range of 100 to 200 square miles and hunt within that range. He'll return to successful kill sites. He'll avoid areas of high human activity. His movements will be predictable within certain parameters. He pointed to his map. Red dots scattered across 600 square miles, clustered in some areas, absent in others, following no logic that anyone could discern. This animal isn't behaving like any lion I've ever studied. It's not territorial, it's nomadic, covering distances that should exhaust any cat within weeks. It's not predictable. It kills in one area, disappears for days or weeks, reappears in a completely different location. It's not avoiding humans, it's approaching structures, testing doors and windows, leaving sign that seems almost. He paused. The room was silent. Almost deliberate, he finished. Almost like it wants us to know it's there. A rancher in the back row spoke up. What kind of animal does that? Sterling didn't have an answer. Nothing in his training, his research, his 15 years of studying predators had prepared him for an animal that seemed to be hunting with intention beyond simple hunger. But he was starting to develop a theory. I think we're dealing with something unusual, he said carefully. Not supernatural. I want to be clear about that. a flesh and blood mountain lion operating within the biological parameters of its species, but perhaps an exceptional individual, one that's learned behaviors we don't typically see. Learned from what? That's what I'm trying to understand. The meeting ended without resolution. The ranchers went home to their properties, their livestock, their long nights of listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. And in the cedar breaks and limestone ravines of the hill country, something continued hunting. Waiting. Learning. By June of 1972, the hill country had lost 147 animals. The number existed only in Dr. Sterling's private records. The official count was far lower, diminished by ranchers who stopped reporting, by game wardens who stopped documenting, by an unspoken agreement that the less said, the better. Talking about the problem made it real, made it something that couldn't be dismissed as exaggeration, hysteria, the overactive imaginations of rural people with too much time and too little education. But Sterling kept counting, kept mapping, kept building a picture of something that defied every model of predator behavior he'd ever studied. The lion, if it was a single lion, which he was no longer certain about, had expanded its range. Kills were now being reported from Blanco County to the east, Mason County to the north, Edwards County to the west. An area of nearly 3,000 square miles, far beyond what any individual cat should be able to patrol. More troubling than the geography was the selection. It's targeting specific properties, Sterling wrote in his field journal on June 14th. Not random predation across a territory, but focused attention on particular ranches. The Cobb Place has lost 11 animals since January. The Chavez spread has lost 31. Meanwhile, adjacent properties with similar livestock densities report no losses whatsoever. The pattern suggests either multiple animals working in coordination, which would be unprecedented for a solitary species, or a single animal that has learned to identify productive hunting grounds and return to them repeatedly. Neither explanation is satisfactory. Neither explanation accounts for the behavioral anomalies that continue to accumulate. The anomalies he referenced were becoming harder to ignore. The lion wasn't just killing livestock anymore. It was appearing, showing itself in ways that mountain lions never did. Billy Patterson was 12 years old in the summer of 1972. His father, Emmett, had been dealing with the livestock losses since the previous fall. The family had lost over 40 goats by June, enough to threaten their livelihood, enough to keep Emmett awake at night with a rifle across his lap, enough to fill their dinner conversations with a fear that Billy was too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel. On the night of June 23rd, Billy saw what his father had been fighting. He'd gotten up to use the bathroom, a common occurrence for a boy who drank too much sweet tea at dinner. The farmhouse bathroom faced the back pasture, and Billy, still half asleep, glanced out the window as he passed. Something was standing in the pasture. Not a goat, not a deer. Something tall and wrong, silhouetted against the moonlit grass perhaps 50 yards from the house. Billy stopped. The sleep fell away from him like water, replaced by a cold clarity he'd never experienced before. The shape was a cat. He could see that now, the long body, the curved tail, the head that turned toward the house as if sensing his attention. But it was standing wrong. Not crouched, not stalking, not moving with the fluid grace that cats were supposed to possess. It was standing on its hind legs. Billy would spend the next 50 years trying to convince himself he'd imagined it, trying to explain away what he'd seen as a trick of moonlight, of perspective, of a 12-year-old brain still fogged with sleep. Cats didn't stand like that, couldn't stand like that. The anatomy was wrong, the physics were wrong, everything about what he was seeing was wrong. But he'd seen it. The lion, if that's what it was, stood upright in the pasture, front legs dangling at its sides, watching the house with eyes that caught the moonlight and held it. Watching with an attention that felt personal, directed, aware. Then it dropped to all fours and was gone. Billy didn't scream, didn't run to his parents, Didn't do any of the things a frightened child should do. He just stood at the bathroom window, frozen, watching the empty pasture until dawn crept over the hills and made the world normal again. He told his father the next morning. Emmett listened without expression, then went to check the pasture. He found tracks and something else. A goat kid, perhaps 3 months old, had been killed during the night. But instead of the usual efficient throat wound, this animal had been arranged. Placed in the center of a bare patch of ground, limbs extended, head positioned to face the house. Positioned to face Billy's window. Emmett Patterson sold the farm 2 months later, moved his family to San Antonio, took a job in construction, never raised livestock again. He never explained his decision to anyone, not his wife, not his children, not the neighbors who watched him leave with confused expressions. He didn't have to explain. Everyone who saw that goat understood. The lion wasn't just hunting. It was communicating. Dr. Sterling's research led him to an uncomfortable hypothesis by late summer of 1972. He'd consulted with colleagues at Texas A&M, at UC Davis, at the Smithsonian's National Zoo. He'd reviewed every documented case of unusual mountain lion behavior in North American history. He'd studied the work of researchers who tracked individual cats for years, building detailed profiles of predator psychology. None of it helped. The behaviors we're observing don't fit any established model, he told the ranchers at a second meeting in August. Mountain lions are ambush predators. They hide, they stalk, they kill, they feed, they move on. They don't display. They don't return to kill sites to leave messages. They don't stand upright to observe human habitations. The room had grown quiet when he mentioned that last point. The Billy Patterson story had spread through the community, whispered between families who didn't want to admit how frightened they were. I've developed a theory, Sterling continued. I want to emphasize that it's speculation. I have no direct evidence to support it, but it's the only explanation that accounts for the pattern of behavior we're seeing. He paused. The ranchers waited. I believe we're dealing with an animal that has been exposed to humans in ways that fundamentally altered its psychology. Perhaps raised in captivity and released. Perhaps escaped from a private collection. Perhaps, and this is the most troubling possibility, deliberately trained. Trained for what? Someone asked. I don't know. Hunting, perhaps. Entertainment. Some purpose that we can't identify because it's not meant for us to understand. You're saying someone made this thing. I'm saying something made this thing what it is. Whether that something was a person, an organization, or just an unusual set of circumstances, I can't determine. But the animal we're dealing with isn't behaving like a wild lion. It's behaving like something that learned about humans in an environment where humans were part of its world. And now it's using what it learned. Sterling nodded slowly. That's my theory. An animal that grew up around people, that learned our patterns and weaknesses, that was somehow released or escaped into an environment where it could apply that knowledge. What does it want? That's the question I can't answer. If it were purely predatory, it would hunt, feed, and avoid contact. What we're seeing suggests something else, something that goes beyond hunger. What goes beyond hunger for a predator? Sterling met the rancher's eyes. Pleasure, territory, revenge, take your pick. None of them have good implications for us. On September 3rd, 1972, the lion stopped hunting livestock. It found something better. Roberto Garza was 26 years old, a ranch hand working the night shift at a cattle operation outside Junction. His job was simple: patrol the perimeter fences, watch for breaks, report any signs of predator activity. He'd been doing it for 3 months without incident, driving the same route every night, seeing nothing more threatening than the occasional coyote. He radioed base at 11:47 p.m. to report all clear. At 12:15 a.m. he radioed again, partial transmission, mostly static, what might have been words but might have been screaming. By 12:30, A search party was heading toward his last known position. They found his truck first. Engines still running, headlights cutting through the darkness, driver's door hanging open. The truck had been stopped in the middle of a pasture road, perhaps a quarter-mile from the nearest fence line. They found Roberto 50 yards from the truck. What was left of him? The attack had been swift. That was the only mercy. The throat wound that had killed so many livestock had killed Roberto too, dropping him before he could feel much of what came next. But what came next had been extensive, prolonged, the kind of feeding that suggested not hunger but something else. Curiosity, maybe. Experimentation. The rancher who found him, a man named Hoskins who'd served in Korea and thought he'd seen everything, had to be hospitalized for shock. He never returned to the property, never returned to ranching at all. The official cause of death was listed as animal attack, species undetermined. The game warden who filed the report knew exactly what species was responsible. He just couldn't bring himself to write it down. Because writing it down would mean admitting that a mountain lion had killed a man. That a mountain lion had hunted a man. That everything they'd been telling themselves about the hill country being safe was a lie. Roberto Garza's death transformed the situation from a livestock problem to something else entirely. Within a week, 3 ranch families had left the area, packed up their belongings, sold their stock at whatever price they could get, and fled to cities where the darkness didn't hold the same terror. Within a month, night patrols had ceased entirely. Ranchers who'd spent their whole lives checking fences and monitoring cattle around the clock suddenly refused to leave their homes after dark. The work still needed doing, cattle still needed tending, fences still needed repair, predators still needed deterrence, but it would have to wait until daylight. The roads went empty after sunset. Headlights that used to sweep through the hills at all hours disappeared. The hill country became a place where the night belonged to something else. And the lion knew it. The kills increased. 20 animals in September, 31 in October. The cat was hunting with impunity now, taking what it wanted, leaving remains positioned in patterns that might have been random but felt deliberate. Every morning brought new discoveries, new carcasses, new tracks circling houses where families had huddled behind locked doors, listening to sounds they didn't want to identify. And new sightings. People who looked out windows at the wrong moment. People who walked to their barns at dusk and saw something watching from the cedar breaks. People who woke from sleep with the certain knowledge that something was outside, something patient, something aware, something that was learning their routines as thoroughly as they were learning to fear it. The lion was becoming familiar. That was the worst part. Not that it was a monster, not that it was deadly, but that it was becoming part of the landscape. A presence that everyone acknowledged and no one discussed. A shadow that fell across every converse. Asian about life in the hill country. You didn't go out at night. You didn't question why. You just understood. Sterling had been tracking the lion for 10 months when he finally found its den. Not through skill. The animal was too clever, too experienced at avoiding pursuit. Through luck, and through a mistake the lion made that suggested even apex predators could be fallible. A rancher named Whitmore had been losing calves from a pasture that bordered a deep ravine, a limestone cut in the hills where runoff had carved caves and overhangs over millennia. Sterling had surveyed the area in August and found nothing. In November, he returned to check again. The cave entrance was hidden behind a curtain of cedar branches, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Sterling almost missed it, would have missed it if not for the smell. Not the smell of death, though that was there too, faint, old, the residue of kills long since consumed. Something else underneath it. Musk, territory marker, the scent of something large and wild that had claimed this space as its own. Sterling didn't enter the cave. He wasn't stupid, and he wasn't armed with anything that would stop a lion in close quarters. But he photographed the entrance, documented the tracks that led in and out, and noted the bones scattered in the underbrush. Cattle bones, goat bones, deer bones, and human bones. A femur, a fragment of skull, pieces of what might have been a hand, scattered by scavengers that had come after the lion finished feeding. Roberto Garza had been the first confirmed human victim. He hadn't been the first human victim. The bones changed everything. Sterling's report went to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, to the county sheriff, to state law enforcement agencies that usually had no interest in wildlife matters. What had been an agricultural problem was now a criminal investigation. The cave was excavated by forensic specialists in late November. What they found made local news, then state news, then national news before someone made phone calls and the coverage quietly disappeared. 7 sets of human remains. 7 people who had disappeared over the past 3 years. Drifters, migrant workers, a hitchhiker who'd never reached his destination. People whose disappearances had never been connected, whose cases had gone cold, whose families had given up hope long before anyone found the bones in the limestone cave. The lion had been hunting humans for years. Long before it started taking livestock, long before it started showing itself, long before anyone in the hill country knew it existed. It had been patient, selective, taking victims who wouldn't be missed, who wouldn't trigger the kind of response that could threaten its territory. Learning, perhaps, about how humans reacted to loss, about what thresholds triggered investigation, about how to hunt the most dangerous prey on Earth without being hunted in return. Only when it had perfected its techniques, only when it was confident enough to take risks, had it begun the campaign of terror that brought it to public attention. The livestock kills went about food. They were about demonstrating dominance, about teaching the hill country who really owned the night. January 1973, almost exactly 1 year after Harlan Cobb found his dead bull. Texas Parks and Wildlife assembled the largest predator hunting operation in state history. 40 men, 16 dogs, helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, military technology borrowed through channels that nobody discussed publicly, tranquilizer guns, conventional firearms, nets, cages, everything that modern wildlife management could bring to bear. They knew where the den was now. They knew the lion's patterns, its preferred travel routes, its hunting schedule. Sterling had spent months mapping every detail, waiting for the resources to act on what he'd learned. The operation launched at dawn on January 15th. For 6 hours, nothing. The dogs followed scent trails that looped and crossed and doubled back, as if the lion was deliberately confusing them. The helicopters spotted heat signatures that turned out to be deer, javelina, feral hogs, everything except the target. The men on the ground pushed through cedar breaks and scrambled over limestone, finding tracks, but never finding what made them. Then at 2:47 p.m., a hunter named Wilkins saw it. The lion was lying on a ledge perhaps 300 yards above the ravine floor, watching the operation with what Wilkins later described as amusement. It wasn't hiding, wasn't fleeing. It was observing, the way a spectator watches a game played by people who don't know the rules. Wilkins raised his rifle, scoped the target, found those yellow eyes looking back at him through the magnification. The lion didn't move. Wilkins fired. The shot was good, center mass, a kill shot on any normal cat. The lion flinched, rolled off the ledge, disappeared into the brush below. "I hit it," Wilkins shouted into H. "Is radio moving to confirm?" 20 men converged on the location. Dogs were released. Helicopters swooped low, thermal cameras hunting for the heat signature of a wounded animal. They found blood, a lot of blood, enough that the wound should have been fatal, should have dropped the lion within minutes. They found tracks, faltering and uneven, leading deeper into the ravine system. They found more blood, diminishing as the trail progressed, as if the wound was closing even as the animal fled. They found nothing else. The search continued for 3 weeks. Every cave was checked. Every ravine was swept. Every inch of the 3,000 square mile territory was surveyed from the air. The lion had vanished. "It's dead," the official report concluded. "Blood loss consistent with a fatal wound. Animal retreated to an inaccessible location to die. Body may never be recovered due to terrain constraints." Case closed. Problem solved. The hill country was safe again. Sterling didn't believe it. Neither did the ranchers. For 6 months after the hunt, nothing happened. No livestock losses, no sightings, no tracks appearing near houses, no scratches on doors, no eyes reflecting headlights on empty roads. The lion was gone, dead in some hidden cave, decomposing in a place where no one would ever find it. That's what everyone told themselves. That's what everyone wanted to believe. Then, in July 1973, Harlan Cobb found another dead bull. Same pasture, same method, same tracks circling the body in that deliberate, patient pattern that suggested something that had all the time in the world. The lion was back, or it had never left. The second wave of kills was different from the first. Fewer animals taken, but taken with a precision that felt personal. The Cobb Ranch lost 3 bulls in 3 months, the best breeding stock Harlan had, animals worth more than his annual income. The Chavez spread lost a prize ram that Ricardo had been planning to show at the state fair. The Patterson property, vacant now, sold to a cattle company after Emmett fled, lost nothing, but tracks appeared on the abandoned porch every morning for a week. The lion was visiting the places where it had been feared, reminding the hill country that it was still there, still watching, still in control. Brendan Murphy was a tough man. 63 years old, former Marine, 3 decades running a cattle operation that had made him one of the most respected ranchers in Care County. He'd heard the stories about the lion, heard about Roberto Garza, heard about the bones in the cave. He didn't care. "It's a cat," he told his wife when she begged him to stop working after dark. "A big cat, but still just a cat. I've killed cats before. I'll kill this one if it comes near my stock." On the night of September 8, 1973, he went out to check a fence line that had been damaged earlier that day. He took a rifle, a flashlight, and the confidence that had carried him through career, through building a ranch from nothing, through every challenge the hill country had thrown at him. He didn't come home. His wife found him the next morning, what was left of him. The rifle had been fired twice. The shots had apparently missed. No blood in the immediate area, no sign that the lion had been wounded. Murphy had died the same way Roberto Garza had died. Throat opened, body fed upon, remains left where they fell. But there was something different about this kill. Murphy's flashlight was still working, lying perhaps 10 feet from his body. The beam was pointed at the ground, illuminating a patch of bare earth. A patch of earth where tracks had been pressed deep into the soil. Tracks that led directly toward the flashlight, as if the lion had wanted the light to fall on them. Tracks that spelled something. Not words, mountain lions can't write words, but shapes, deliberate shapes pressed into the ground with claws that could have carved through bone. 2 parallel lines. A circle. A shape that looked almost like an arrow, pointing toward the ranch house where Murphy's wife was sleeping. The sheriff who investigated the scene took photographs of the tracks. The photographs were never released publicly. The official report made no mention of the shapes, just noted unusual track patterns possibly caused by the animal circling the victim. But the men who saw those photographs talked, quietly, to people they trusted, in conversations that were never recorded. The lion had left a message. Nobody knew what it meant, but everybody understood the implication. It wasn't done. 1974 was the year the hill country broke. Not publicly, not in any way that made newspapers or prompted government response. The fear that had been building for 2 years simply reached a threshold where normal life became impossible. Ranchers stopped going out at night. That had already happened. But now they stopped going out in the evenings too, stopped being caught on their properties after 4 p.m. in winter, after 7 p.m. in Sioux. Emma rushed through their work with one eye on the horizon, calculating how much daylight remained, planning routes to get back to shelter before the shadows grew long. Some ranchers stopped going out alone at all, formed groups, 3 men minimum, for any task that required leaving the house. Carried rifles everywhere, even to church, even to the feed store, even to the school where their children tried to pretend everything was normal. The children knew it wasn't normal. They'd stopped playing outside after school, stopped walking to friends' houses, stopped doing anything that might put them in the open when the daylight faded. They didn't understand what was hunting their parents' livestock, but they understood the fear. They absorbed it like sponges, carrying it into adulthood, passing it to their own children like a genetic disorder. Businesses suffered, properties sold at losses. Young people who might have stayed to work the family land left for cities where the night was full of streetlights instead of shadows. The lion had won. Not by killing, though it kept killing sporadically, unpredictably, just often enough to remind everyone it was there. By existing, by being something that couldn't be hunted, couldn't be trapped, couldn't be driven away. By being patient, by waiting, by teaching an entire region that the darkness belonged to something else. The last confirmed kill attributed to the lion occurred on March 14, 1975. A calf taken from a pen on the Cobb Ranch, the same ranch where Harlan had found the first victim 3 years earlier. The same efficient throat wound, the same patient feeding, the same tracks circling the body in patterns that had become horribly familiar. After that, nothing. No more kills, no more sightings, no more tracks appearing on porches or scratches on doors. The lion vanished as completely as it had after the hunt, but this time it stayed vanished. For months, the ranchers waited, checked their stock every morning, expecting to find the familiar carnage, looked over their shoulders at dusk, expecting to see those eyes watching from the cedar breaks. Nothing. A year passed, 2 years, 5. The lion didn't return. Slowly, tentatively, the hill country began to recover. People started going out after dark again, not comfortably, not carelessly, but out. Night patrols resumed. Children played in the fading light. The fear didn't disappear, but it faded to something manageable, something that could be carried without crushing. The official explanation was that the lion had died. Old age, accumulated wounds, the natural end of an animal that had somehow survived far longer than it should have. Case closed, permanently this time. Nobody believed it, but everybody accepted it. Because the alternative was accepting that the lion had simply stopped, that it had achieved whatever goal drove its 3-year campaign of terror, and having achieved it, had no further interest in the hill country. That it had won, and winners don't need to keep fighting. Adrian Sterling left Texas Parks and Wildlife in 1976. He never explained his resignation, never published the research he'd accumulated over 4 years of tracking the hill country lion, never spoke publicly about what he'd observed or what conclusions he'd drawn. But his private papers, discovered after his death in 2003, told a different story. 3 boxes of notes, maps, photographs, and analysis that he'd kept hidden for nearly 30 years. Documentation of a phenomenon that he'd never been able to explain and hadn't dared to share. The key document was a report dated June 1975, 3 months after the last confirmed kill. It was titled Preliminary Assessment, Anomalous Predator Behavior, 1970 to 1975. It was 47 pages long. The conclusions were disturbing. The animal exhibited behaviors that I cannot reconcile with known mountain lion psychology, Sterling wrote. The targeting of specific properties, The apparent awareness of human investigation. The messages, if that is what they were, left at kill sites. The 3-year duration of activity followed by sudden cessation. I have considered the possibility that we were dealing with multiple animals. The evidence does not support this hypothesis. Track measurements remained consistent throughout the activity period. DNA analysis of hair samples recovered from kill sites indicated a single individual. Whatever was responsible, it was one animal. I have considered the possibility of learned behavior, an animal exposed to humans in ways that altered its normal psychology. This hypothesis has some explanatory power, but fails to account for the most troubling observations. No training, however sophisticated, could produce the level of apparent planning and communication that I documented. I have considered the possibility that I was mistaken. That stress, fear, and the pressure of investigation caused me to see patterns that weren't there. This is the explanation I prefer. It is not the explanation I believe. What I believe, and I acknowledge that this belief may be irrational, is that we were dealing with something outside the normal parameters of predator behavior. An animal that was, in some sense I cannot define, aware. Not intelligent in the human sense, but aware. Conscious of itself, conscious of its impact, conscious of the fear it was creating. An animal that understood what it was doing, and chose to do it anyway. The ranchers who lived through those years are mostly gone now. Harlan Cobb died in 1987, still on the land where he'd found the first kill. His grandson runs the property now and doesn't talk about what his grandfather told him before he died. Ricardo Chavez sold his sheep operation in 1975 and moved to Houston. He never returned to the hill country, never explained why, never stopped checking the locks on his doors after dark. Sarah Whitfield lived to 91, dying in 2001 in the same farmhouse where something had scratched at her door. She never spent another night there alone. The Patterson family scattered across Texas and beyond. Billy, the boy who saw the lion standing upright in the moonlight, became a professor of psychology in California. He specializes in trauma. He doesn't discuss why. But a few old-timers remain. Men and women in their 70s and 80s who were young adults during the terror years, who remember what it felt like to be afraid of the dark. They don't talk about it much, not to outsiders, not to younger people who wouldn't understand. But among themselves, late at night, when the memories press close and the darkness outside feels the same as it did 50 years ago, they share what they remember. The sound of something circling their houses in the small hours. The tracks that appeared on porches, on roads, on the bare ground outside bedroom windows. The way the dogs stopped barking after the first few months, not because they'd stopped hearing the lion, but because they'd learned that barking attracted its attention. The feeling of being watched, being assessed, being measured against some standard they couldn't understand. And the question that none of them can answer. What was it really? Not what species, not what size, not what origin. What was the thing in the darkness that spent 3 years teaching the hill country to fear? Was it a lion, a monster, something in between? Or was it something that wore the shape of a lion because that shape was useful, a mask that let it hunt without being understood, without being truly seen? They don't know. They'll never know. But they remember. And they still check the locks. And they still listen for sounds that shouldn't be there. And they still avoid the night. Drive through Kimball County now, and you'll see what looks like any rural Texas landscape. Cattle grazing in pastures, goats on hillsides, deer jumping fences in the early morning, a countryside at peace with itself, productive and prosperous and safe. But look closer. The old ranch houses all have new locks, heavy-duty deadbolts that seem excessive for properties where crime is almost non-existent. The fences are higher than they need to be, topped with barbed wire that serves no agricultural purpose. The dogs are bigger, trained for protection rather than herding. And nobody goes out after dark. Not really, not the way people do in other places. The roads are empty when the sun goes down. The fields are silent. The night belongs to something else, something that may be gone, may be dead, may never have been what anyone thought it was, but might still be out there. Waiting, patient, watching the hill country the way it watched for 3 terrible years, when the darkness learned to hunt and the ranchers learned to hide. Ask the old-timers what really happened in 1972. They'll tell you about the livestock losses, the attacks, the fear that changed everything. But if you ask them why a mountain lion would behave that way, why it would terrorize a region for 3 years and then stop, why it would seem to communicate, to plan, to choose its victims with something that looked like intention, they won't have an answer. Just silence. Just a look that says, some questions shouldn't be asked. Just a glance toward the window, toward the darkness outside, toward whatever might still be watching. The hill country survived what happened in the 1970s. But it never forgot. And it never stopped being afraid. The last reported sighting of an unusually large mountain lion in the Texas hill country occurred in 2019. A trail camera on a ranch near Junction captured an image at 3:47 a.m., a shape that didn't quite match the profile of a normal cat, proportions that seemed wrong, eyes that caught the infrared flash and threw it back with an intensity that made the ranch owner delete the file and throw away the camera. He told no one. He checked his logs. He stayed inside after dark. Because some lessons, once learned, stay learned. Forever. And in the hill country, everyone remembers what their grandparents taught them. The night doesn't belong to you. It never did. And whatever claimed it 50 years ago might still be out there. Waiting. Patient. Hungry.